Well, turn with me again to Romans 5, and the passage that we'll be considering this morning will be from verse 12 to the end of the chapter. So Romans 5:12 to 21. And so it begins, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. And so if we ever begin a passage that begins with the word therefore, we need to immediately consider what the writer is referring to. He's saying, therefore, because of something else, in light of what I've just said, consider this. So what is he referencing? Well, lots of people think that he's referencing the verse immediately before that, verse 11. And there's a lot to be said for that. Some people think that he's referencing the whole section before, so verse 1 to 11, where Paul outlines the reconciliation that we have with God and the peace that we have with God through faith in Jesus. And that's true as well. And some people will go further back to say that he's summarizing his teaching from chapter 4 onwards, where he's talking about, again, justification by faith in the case of Abraham and then to us. And all of those are right. But I think, actually, Paul is summarizing much more than that. Really, what he's doing here is summarizing the whole of the letter that he's written so far. What he's doing is tying all the strings together that he's mentioned into one thread. If you imagine a cord and it's made of lots of little cords all wrapped around to make one thick cord, and that's what he's doing here. Because in this passage, he talks about sin and righteousness, which he's been mentioning throughout the letter. He talks about life and death, which he's been speaking of throughout the letter. He talks about the law and grace, which he mentions in chapters 3 and 4. And he even talks about the lack of distinction between persons. He's talking about the breakdown of the distinction between the Jew and the Gentile, which he mentions in chapters 2 and 3. So he's taking all of these threads that he's mentioned and he's pulling them into one major thought, which not only does he mention in this passage, but is the foundation then for what he goes on to say in the rest of the letter. And the commentator Anders Nygren says that this is the point where all the lines of Paul's thinking converge, both those of the preceding chapters, the ones that have come before, and those of the chapters to follow. And so he has tied everything together into this short summary of what he's been teaching. Now, as I've read through this morning, you might think, well, this is quite a complicated passage. And it is, and not necessarily because of what Paul is teaching, but just because the structure that Paul has written in isn't so easy to follow. Because in verse 12, he begins a sentence, and at the end of that sentence, depending on your translation, you might have a bracket, you might have a hyphen, something like that. Does he ever finish that sentence? Well, that's a question we have to often ask with Paul. He gets so excited as he's writing and so excited as he's speaking that he just stops saying one thing and goes off on something else. And you think, does he ever return to it? Like he does in chapter 1 of this letter, where he says first, and he doesn't ever seem to get on to saying second. And that's what Paul is like. So does he ever finish this verse, verse 12? No, he doesn't. But he does restate it and finish his argument in verses 18 and 19. And so if we think of the structure of this passage, he makes his argument in verse 12, 18 and 19, and everything in between that is extra information. If you think it could be in brackets or something like that. Now, that doesn't mean it's not important. It's very important. Paul really is teaching things of great importance in verses 13 to 17. But it's additional information which doesn't influence his argument. And so that's the structure of what he's doing. So we ask him, what is he talking about? What is he doing? Well, he's making a comparison. He's making a big comparison. He's comparing two results, a comparison of results. He's saying that one thing, one action has led to one result, and another action has led to another result. And what he's focused on here is the behavior of mankind. Okay? He's not talking here about our position before God, our standing before God. He does that in verses 1 to 11. He's talking about the result of certain actions. And in both arguments, in both sides of his comparison, he's saying one thing, which might seem small, has led to massive consequences. One thing has affected many people. So let's restate his argument. What is he saying through this passage? He's saying, in the same way that sin and death came in through one man, Adam, which resulted in condemnation, in that same way, righteousness and life came in through one man, Jesus, resulting in justification. So he's saying Adam disobeyed God, and when he disobeyed God, death came into the world, and the result of that is condemnation, being in the wrong sight of God, being wrong, doing wrong things according to what God has said should be done. And in the other way, Jesus obeyed God, and that brought in life, which leads to being right, doing the right things in the sight of God. And so those are the two things which he's comparing. There are two sides, and we'll look at this passage and consider this from those two sides. And so the first thing that we need to think about this morning is Adam's defeat. Adam's defeat. Now, we live in a world that is full of defeat. I'm sure you know some. I'm sure you see it around you every day. In fact, the reason that we're here on Zoom is because of defeat. My body has been defeated by the world. I'm unable to come to you because I'm not well enough. And the only reason that's a consideration is because there's a pandemic and a disease which is ravaging the world because of this defeat. You might know people who are addicted to drugs. They've been defeated. People who are addicted to pornography. They've been defeated. Marriages have been defeated. Family and life itself has been defeated. And so as we look at the world, it's very, very easy to become depressed and discouraged. And you would be in very good company if you looked out at the world and you saw the world of defeat and you saw the world of chaos and you said, why is this happening? You'd be in very good company because people have been doing that for thousands and thousands of years, looking at the world and saying, what is going on? And when people look and they consider the world, they try and come up with reasons. And so you might have the reason of philosophy, where they might say that there's no such thing as evil and defeat at all, in fact. Everything is based on your opinion. And there's no such thing really as evil. That's just what you don't like. Or you might have the explanation that science gives, that the evil in mankind is our fight for survival. We're trying to beat each other, get up one rung up, and be better than everybody else so we can have children and they can have children and so on. Or you might look at other religions or myths where a box is opened and all the evil of the world comes out. Or the gods are fighting with each other, which is why there's chaos. There's lots of different reasons which people could give for the defeat and the evil in the world. Christianity has a reason as well. But the big difference is that it is the reason. It's the true reason. It's the only reason, I'm convinced, that explains all the evil in the world and all the defeat in the world. And the Bible's teaching is there was an initial defeat one point at which somebody was first defeated, and from all of that, all of the defeat has come. And we read of that in the Bible at the very beginning in the book of Genesis, where God had finished creating everything, and he'd taken his man and he put him in the garden, in the special area that he was supposed to cultivate and look after, and that would spread out, the order would spread out over the whole world into a world completely commanded, controlled by man, and man would be in a wonderful, loving relationship with God forever. And God gave an instruction to Adam. He said, you can eat whatever you want. You're free to eat any fruit in the garden, but there's one tree that you must not eat from. And the day that you eat from that tree, you will certainly die. And Adam did eat from the fruit of that tree. He sinned, and so he died. And he lost all the good things that he had from being close with God. God could come and walk in the garden, and Adam could be with him. He lost that. God came down to the garden, and Adam was afraid. He could be naked with no shame because there was nothing to be guilty about. He lost that. He needed to be covered. He didn't have to work. That changed. He had to cultivate the ground, and it was hard for him then. There would be strife between him and his wife before it was perfect. He lost all of those good things. But the big problem with that is that Adam, when he sinned, it wasn't just him alone, really. Because Adam was our representative in the garden. What do I mean by that? Well, if you imagine the leader of a company, the top man in a company or top woman in a company, and whatever decision they make affects the whole of the company. And the people who work for her, doesn't matter in a way what they think about the decision that she's made, it directly affects them. She is representing them. And if she makes a decision which positively impacts them, they all benefit. And if she makes a decision which negatively impacts them, they all suffer for it. So Adam sinned, so he died. And because he was our head, when he died, we died. And what do dead people do? Well, dead people sin. Dead people sin a lot. Dead people love to sin. And that sin, which we commit, breaking the laws of God, doing what we want, being mean to each other, being selfish and greedy, being deceitful, all of those things lead to condemnation from God. And so when God looks at our life, he says, you've done all of these things that are wrong. You didn't live in obedience to me. You didn't live in love to me. Because the thing is, when Adam died in the garden, initially, that was not his body dying. It was his link with God. His spiritual life was dead. The connection that he had with God was severed. And so all of these defeats, everything which we thought about this morning, came by one action, and it resulted in a chain reaction of sin and death. And that's what we mean by original sin. If you hear people talking about original sin, that's what they're talking about. That from Adam, our link with God, our connection with God initially has been severed, cut. We're dead. When we're born, we're dead to God, and so we sin. And so we live a life of sin, and we live a life of loving sin. So I want you to consider a car, and there's a driver, and there are passengers in the car. And if the car is driven off the cliff by the driver, everybody is affected by that. Even the passengers are affected by that. I imagine that probably at least one of you is thinking, well, hang on, but if I'm just a passenger in that car, how is that fair for me to be held responsible for what the driver has done? Well, see, therein lies our problem, because if we were put in Adam's position, we'd have done the exact same thing. The driver of the car is self-confident. He knows he can do it. And all the passengers are self-confident as well. We think we can do it, even in sin, don't we? We think that we can be good people. In my hometown some years ago, in the city centre, there was a terrible car crash in the night. The car, full of teenagers, was driving down the centre of Newport, about 100 miles per hour, and the car flipped, hit a lamppost, and it exploded, and everybody died. The reason for that was that the driver of the car had been taking drugs, and he wasn't able to able to drive the car safely. But the point is that the passengers, they were also responsible for what happened, because they got in knowing they were complicit, they were in agreement. And so when we sin in our lives, we show that we're complicit, we're in agreement with what Adam has done, and we deserve to be condemned by God. So what does that all mean for us today? It might seem a bit hopeless. We've been driven off a cliff, we've hit the ground and the car has exploded and we're all dead. But what does a dead passenger need? If there's been a terrible car crash, what needs to happen? That person needs to be rescued. Needs a rescuer. And that is what Paul compares the defeat with. What does a defeat need to undo it? It needs a triumph. It needs success. And that is the second part of Paul's argument. The first part is that Adam was defeated. The second part is Jesus is triumphant, which we see in 19b. So if you look quickly at verse 19b, so also through the obedience of the one man, that's Jesus, the many will be made righteous. And so we spoke earlier of the defeat in the world and Christianity's reason for that. But the wonderful thing, this is really wonderful, is that Christianity also has an answer for the problem of the defeat. It's not just that God has told us that you're dead in your trespasses and sins, and this is why, and I'm just going to stand back and I'm going to let you all go on and carry on as you are. No, God has told us, and he's done something about it, because Adam's sin wasn't unexpected. God is all-knowing, yes? And so when he created the world, he already knew that sin would enter the world. He already knew that Adam wouldn't listen and would disobey. And so he already, even before he created the world, had a plan, which is why we can read in the Bible that Jesus was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. The plan of salvation, the triumph, Jesus overcoming all of this, was already in God's mind before the first sin had even been committed. Though Paul says, just as through one man, so something similar has happened. One man sinned, and in that same way, someone has done something else. Adam came first and he was defeated, but there was a second Adam, and that second Adam was Jesus. Adam was our head. He was our representative. And in that same way, Jesus is our head. Jesus is our representative. We read in verse 14. Death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who is a pattern of the one to come. So Adam was always pointing forward, pointing to a better representative, pointing to a better head. And if you think in the garden, we read that Satan came to Adam. He came to Adam and he tempted him, and Adam gave in. And Satan also came to Jesus. And we read in the accounts of Jesus' life that Jesus was driven out, pushed by the Spirit into the wilderness where Satan came to him. And Satan didn't just tempt Adam once. He tempted him three times. And every time Jesus responded, and every time Jesus was victorious. Now, 3 is an important number in the Bible. If something happens 3 times, or it's said 3 times, it means it's definitely done. That is done. It's not insignificant that Peter denied Jesus 3 times and then affirmed his love for him later 3 times as well. So what's the Bible teaching? Well, when Matthew has these 3 accounts of the temptations, Matthew is saying that Jesus definitely beat Satan. Satan was smashed into the ground, if you like. It's like a boxer, and 3 good hits and the man is down and he's out and he's beaten. There's only one thing he can do, which is crawl away, which is exactly what Satan did. Jesus obeyed, so he lived. So we can live in him. And if we're alive in him, we obey God, which leads to justification, affirmation and confirmation from God, and peace with him. Jesus did everything that God expected of him. He followed his law perfectly. He was perfect in his thoughts as well as in his behavior. And so he lived. Well, what does that mean? You might say one of the classic teachings, one of the most famous teachings in Christianity is that Jesus was killed on the cross. Yes, he was. But 3 days later, he was raised from death. He had life in him. Death couldn't hold him, it says in the Bible. It couldn't keep a grip of him because God was pleased with him and he had life in him. And when we have faith in Jesus, we have that same life come into us. That same life that Jesus had, which gave him the strength to obey, we now have in him. And so we obey as well. I'm not teaching here that you can be saved if you do what God has asked you. That's not what Paul is teaching. Okay? He's dealt with in verses 1 to 11 that life, justification, and peace with God comes through faith in Jesus Christ. That is the first thing that needs to come. This life and obedience that we can have in him comes after. We believe in Jesus first, then Jesus' life comes into us because we're in Jesus, and so we obey Jesus. So let's think again of our car illustration. We've gone down, our car has exploded and we've died. And then we wake up in the hospital. And somehow, though we're not quite sure how, we've been rescued and brought back to life. And I imagine, if any of you have been in a car crash, that you're a more careful driver now than you were before. And this is what this is driving at. This is what it's getting at. Once you've been plucked from death in a car, you'll be careful on the road because you know what could happen. And so I wonder, brothers and sisters, are you living as though you've been plucked from death? Do you, whenever you have a temptation to sin, think, no, that was what killed me? And that's abhorrent and disgusting to God. I've been saved from all of that. So I don't want to do it anymore. Are we the Christian embodiment, I suppose, of the careful driver? Are we always thinking about what we've been saved from, a life of sin and disobedience, and going to a life of obedience? But we continue in Paul's contrast, and this is a really wonderful thing about his teaching, is that he's not just comparing the result, he's comparing the magnitude, the size of that result. Because he says in verse 14, death reigned. But he says in verse 15, but how much more? And again in verse 15, he talks about the life overflowing to many. In verse 17, he says again, how much more, and God's abundance. And in verse 18, he can even talk of all people. So he's saying that one sin resulted in many sinners, but one righteous act has resulted in many righteous people. And he's weighing them up. He's looking at what's happened, and he's saying there's defeat on the one hand, and there's triumph in the other. And which one has been successful? It has been the triumph. The triumph has triumphed. It's so big, Paul can't express it. He's so keen to express it that in verse 18, he even talks about all people. And he doesn't say there, he's not saying that everyone will be saved. He's not saying everyone will be saved. He's making a contrast of size to emphasize God's glory. Okay? And he does a similar thing when he talks about the lighter momentary afflictions of this life not being worth comparing to the glory to come. Well, we know that for Paul, his life wasn't lighter momentary afflictions. He speaks at one point of despairing of life itself. He had a hard time. It was painful for him. But what he's doing there is saying that the size, the weight of this glory just makes everything else look tiny. And that's the same thing he's doing here. That he's looking at the results being so big, so much bigger than the initial act, that he can go and talk about all. What he's saying is, look at how much more God has triumphed over everything that was wrong in the world. And so, Christians, this morning I want to comfort you, because if you've fallen into sin, or you feel beaten, or you're scared of death, or you're scared of what's happening in the world around us, and everything's going wrong, I want to remind you that God has triumphed. That Paul can say how much more grace has abounded, how much more has God done to overcome the sin. You can look out and see a world full of defeat, but that will not swallow up the victory that God has had through Jesus. It's the other way around. And we're just waiting for that. We're waiting for that day when Jesus is going to return, and all of the defeat will be gathered up and thrown into the fire and destroyed. And it doesn't matter how much of that you can see now, but take comfort in knowing that it is coming, and it will come. And the world will continue to break. It will continue to fall apart. That's what dead things do. They fall apart. But that doesn't mean that God's victory will stop, because living things continue to live and they continue to grow. And that's what God is doing even this morning. And I want to encourage you and exhort you, push you to defeat sin in your own life. You've been pulled from that burning wreck and brought back to life. Don't live in sin anymore. Live in obedience to God, which Jesus did as well. And by his strength, you can do it. His Spirit will come and be with you, and you can live in obedience as Jesus lived in obedience. How terrible it is that after being saved, we go and crawl again into a burning car because we enjoyed the thrill of driving fast and the thrill of plummeting to the ground, ignoring the fact that it killed us. Terrible, isn't it? So let's encourage each other and encourage ourselves to stay away from all of that and to live in obedience to God. And I wonder, if you're not a Christian this morning, we've been thinking of these two sides, the defeat of Adam and the triumph of Jesus. I wonder what side you'd like to be on. Do you want to be on the side of the loser and the side of death and the side of defeat, or do you want to be on the side of victory? The difficult thing is that when you're living in death, it seems so much fun. You think, I can do what I want, and that's brilliant. But remember it for what it is, living in death. And if you're deluded and you think that doing all these terrible things is of any benefit to you or of any gain to you, remember, I'm living in death. I'm living on the loser's side. And they might think they're winning, but they're not. But the wonderful thing is that you can be included in the many as well. God's gift of grace and life, which he mentions in verse 15, through Jesus Christ can overflow to you as well. And when your sin increases, wherever your sin increases, grace can increase all the more. The gift can increase all the more to cover your sin and bring you close to God. And it doesn't just bring you close to God. It brings you to eternal life through Jesus Christ. Life forever, without any defeat, just victory, no pandemic, no nothing. You can come if you believe in Jesus, and he will take you in, and you will have his life running through you, and you will be close to God for the first time. So come, turn from your death and sin and come to him and love him. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.